remainder of our time is going to be taking care of constructivism in IR theory and ontological security in IR theory. And each of those sessions is going to lead us to the point where we have a final exam essay. And as it happens, we have a week off for Thanksgiving. So since Thanksgiving is always on Thursday, and that's the date that this seminar is held, you'll have a week in between the second and the third sessions on ontological security theory. So we're wanting to do the lottery so we can settle who has which panel for panels 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Please, if you haven't already done so, look at your syllabus schedule and make any final decisions about your ranked preference order for panels. And if you have any questions about panel 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10, now's the time to ask them so that you can then finalize your preferences for panels. So any questions about any of the remaining panels?
Could you just give like a broad overview of the differences between ontological and constructive theory?
Okay, so what you'll find is we've run into the term constructivism already in Hollis and Smith. We know that constructivism is primarily a methodology, but insofar as it also counts as a theory, it is split between constructivism in an explanatory mode and constructivism in an interpretivist mode. So for instance, panel 6 is going to be dealing with what we call conventional constructivism. This is an attempt to have constructivism fit explanation. And the idea here is that state behavior is caused by the combination of actors' commitments to political identity and the interests that follow those identity commitments. But it looks from that point forward in terms of identifying cause and effect and stuff like that. It resembles structural theories. It resembles realism. Not in content, but in methodology. Now, both panels 7 and 8 look at the opposite side of that, which is constructivism as a mode of understanding. So panel 7 looks at authors that identify reasons based in laws and other norms. And panel 8 will look at constructivism as understood through reasons that are generated by political narratives. A lot of times that refers to identity narratives. And so you've got that overlap. Now, ontological security theory comes out of constructivism, but it's not limited to constructivism. And it's a particular kind of understanding of what actors aim to secure. So for realism, the objects of security are material. We want to secure our borders. And by that I mean our territorial borders, our literal territorial borders. We want to secure our citizens. We want to secure our natural resources. We want to secure our airspace. We want to secure the territorial waters that surround the country, and so forth. Ontological security theory focuses on attempts to protect political identity. And what we find is that gets complicated because states, like individuals, carry with them multiple and often crisscrossing identities. And so what does it mean to protect American identity or British identity, or you just name whatever country is there? And identity conceptions play a big role, especially if you're talking about ideology. So all of the material in panel 9 and 10 has to do with what does it mean to secure state identity? How does the concept of the security dilemma apply to that concept? That's panel 9. And then panel 10 looks at a particular kind of dynamic called ontological dissonance, which is the situation when a country has multiple identities and each of its main identities are threatened by something that takes place. And in trying to secure each identity, each other identity seems to be undermined. So how does that theory go about the business of accounting for that? And here you see some kind of mixture of explanation and understanding. All right, I hope that answers your question adequately.
Yes.
Any other questions? All right, well then, just like you did last time, put your name on a piece of paper.
Can I use a piece of paper?
Then rank your panels in order from first, second, third, fourth, fifth important. I see that Seth is not here. So if it turns out that there are panels that are left open, he's just going to get one of the ones that's left open, because that's what happens when you're not here. And when you're done with your preference list, bring it on up. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh my. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to make two people happy right away. Alex, you're the only person that has panel 7 as your first choice, so you get panel 7. Hope, you're the only person that wants panel 8 as your first choice, so you will get panel 8. You're welcome. Everyone else is competing for panel 9. Now, we can't have 4 presentations on panel 9. We can have 2. And that means that we're going to have to find some sort of arbitrary way of deciding who gets panel 2. I am going to ask each of the 4 that have put panel 9 as their number 1 to give me a number between 1 and 25. And the 2 numbers that are the closest to the number that I've written down on this piece of paper, you will have the panel, and the other 2 people will have to figure out what your second, third, fourth choices are, and at that point, we'll try and cover all of the remaining panels. All right, Rahul, a number between 1 and 25. What do you think it is?
20.
20. Matt?
16.
16. Isabel? 7. Dylan?
2.
2. And the number is,
7.
you're clairvoyant. So you get 7. 7 gets panel 9 because they picked 7 exactly. So Isabel is on panel 9. And let's see. 2 is 5 away from 7, and that's the closest. So Dylan will also get panel number 9. All right. Now, Matt, your second choice is panel 10. How about we put you on panel 10? And we already have someone on panel 8. But why not? So Rahul will put you on panel 8 with Hope, and Seth will get panel 6. We've got all the panels covered. Okay. Tonight we're doing part 2 of offensive realism, and we had Mearsheimer chapters 5, 6, and 7, plus Matt Craning's article on nuclear superiority and the balance of resolve, and our, to the best of my recollection, first time there's a newspaper article in here. So David Sanger's 2022 New York Times article on Biden taking his lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis and trying to deal with the first round of nuclear threats coming from Vladimir Putin in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we're trying to make sense of offensive realism. That's the mission, making sense of offensive realism. So we have Alex with his paper, so please call up Alex's paper. Last name Kaysen. Do I have a sign-in sheet? I don't think so. Where's the
Yes, right over
sign-in
here.
sheet? Because everyone has signed it. All right, thank you. All right, Alex, whenever you're ready.
Since the dawn of the atomic age, only 2 nuclear weapons have ever been utilized in direct conflict. These, of course, being the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. Even so, nations have often found themselves at the brink of nuclear conflict on numerous occasions, even after the development of second strike capabilities and the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. What accounts for this? Why would states continually threaten the use of nuclear weapons, knowing full well following through on them would prove catastrophic for themselves and the world?
Wait,
What was the name of the panel paper again?
Cason, CASO.
That's not on the rough draft section of files.
really?
Is it just like on pages maybe, or on another one?
I'm sorry to interrupt you, by the way.
No, you're
Well, thank you for interrupting. How about I do this? How about I quickly run back to my office and make sure I haven't overlooked putting this into Canvas files. So just give me about 3 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't see
I thought it was
Yeah.
having a stroke.
That-
Since the dawn of the atomic age, only 2 nuclear weapons have ever been utilized in direct conflict. These, of course, being the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. Even so, nations have often found themselves at the brink of nuclear conflict on numerous occasions, even after the development of second strike capabilities and the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. What accounts for this? Why would states continually threaten the use of nuclear weapons, knowing full well following through on them would prove catastrophic for themselves and the world? I argue that under the lens of offensive realism, nuclear brinkmanship can be understood as a logical strategy for power maximization. Offensive realism contends that states are rational actors seeking to maximize their relative power to ensure their survival in an anarchic international system. The overarching objective of great powers in the system is to become hegemons, meaning they have sufficient military power and wealth to dominate the region of the world. One method of achieving hegemony is through gaining nuclear superiority over all its rivals. Even though states are unlikely to attain nuclear hegemony, they will constantly be gunning for it because of the tremendous benefits it can provide. A state with nuclear superiority could effectively dominate their region or even the world without the need to sustain a significant level of conventional military forces. These states could blackmail all others. Blackmailing under offensive realism is a specific strategy that states employ to increase their power, which relies on states utilizing the threat of force to make rivals submit to them. The effectiveness of nuclear blackmail has been severely diminished as multiple powers now have their own nuclear arsenals, yet multiple states have utilized this method in attempts to gain concessions from adversaries. In a MAD world, levying threats of nuclear use are inherently risky, as they will likely be met in kind by other nuclear armed powers. When such an incident occurs, it creates a nuclear crisis. According to nuclear brinkmanship theory, the outcomes of such crises are determined by each participant's level of resolve, which determines the amount of risk they are willing to accept before backing down. Traditional brinkmanship theory has tended to discount the nuclear balance between states in determining the outcome of nuclear crises, instead asserting that the primary indicator of a nation's level of resolve is its political stake in the crisis. Work by Matthew Craning.
Just think of the O and the E as an A.
Okay. However, suggests that the nuclear balance between states is pertinent to calculating a state's level of resolve. This stems from the assumption that if a crisis were to escalate to nuclear war, the state with nuclear superiority would be able to inflict a greater degree of damage on their rival. This in turn increases the amount of risk the nuclear superior state is willing to bear. Furthermore, his findings show that states which hold nuclear superiority over their rival or rivals in a nuclear crisis are likely to see victory in 64% of cases, compared to only 6% rate of victory for nuclear inferior countries. Here, victory is defined as a state achieving its basic goals during the crisis. From this, we can account for states' continuous drive to improve and expand their nuclear arsenals in the MAD world. Even those powers which have developed effective second strike systems will still seek to further develop their first strike capabilities. While nuclear crises are relatively rare, states which initiate or find themselves involved in one stand in a significantly better position if they hold nuclear superiority. seems self-evident that no rational state would utilize nuclear weapons in conflict. After all, many states have developed sophisticated second strike capabilities, ensuring that an attack will inevitably bring equivocal retribution down on the aggressor. Despite this, states often use the threat of nuclear force to escalate tensions to get rivals to back down. In the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, President Vladimir Putin has frequently touted the possibility of deploying tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield as conventional Russian troops have faltered and progress has stalled. This behavior seemed almost irrational. Why would Russia consider utilizing nuclear weapons with the knowledge that Ukraine has the backing of the NATO countries, including the nuclear-armed United States, United Kingdom, and France? This presents somewhat of a paradox. Under offensive realism, states are assumed to be rational actors, yet in situations like this, they seem to be acting irrationally. This may seem to contradict the theory, but it can be explained without undermining basic assumptions. For nuclear threats to be considered credible, adversaries must believe that the state is willing to risk escalation. This is the threat that leaves something to chance, as described by Thomas Shelby, formulator of nuclear brinkmanship theory. During nuclear brinkmanship Crane's edition of nuclear superiority and calculating a state's level of resolve, we can say that nuclear escalation and the accumulation of development of nuclear arsenals are rational actions undertaken to maximize a state's power. When faced with a nuclear crisis, states engage in sophisticated calculations of the potential risks and rewards associated with escalation. As previously stated, holding nuclear superiority increases the level of resolve of a state in a crisis and ultimately enhances its prospects of victory. This provides strong incentives for states to bolster their nuclear arsenals even after they have developed effective second strike systems. From this framework, I will now analyze the classic case of nuclear crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and one of the more recent cases, the Russia-Ukraine war, to support the rationality of nuclear brinkmanship. The Cuban Missile Crisis is widely regarded as the closest instance the world ever came to nuclear Armageddon. In 1962, the United States discovered that the Soviet Union had begun constructing nuclear launch sites in Cuba, only 90 miles off the Florida coast. This is seen as an attempt to shift the balance of power in favor of the Soviets during the Cold War. The proximity of Soviet nuclear arms to the mainland United States would provide them with an incredibly useful bargaining chip to extract concessions. After the first warnings of President Kennedy were ignored, an indication that the Soviets were willing to escalate, a blockade was put in place around Cuba. Despite this, the Soviets continued with their original plan to deploy offensive weapons on the island. After days of increasing escalation from each side, the Soviets eventually agreed to destroy and remove all Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for the removal of U.S. nuclear missiles from Turkey. Neither the United States nor the Soviet Union wished to engage in direct nuclear war, but according to nuclear brinkmanship theory, threats need to be perceived as credible to gain concessions. Cronin categorizes the Cuban Missile Crisis as a victory for the United States since it achieved its goal of the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. Further, he attributes this victory in large part to the nuclear superiority the U.S. held over the Soviet Union at the time. The U.S. was also cognizant of this superiority and seemed to have directly affected the decision-making of U.S. officials. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine stalled in late 2022, President Vladimir Putin has started to deploy tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. This comes after his conventional forces found themselves pushed back at every front after the rapid advancement into Ukraine during the early months of the war failed to obtain its surrender. Since this successful repel of Russian forces, Ukraine has enjoyed widespread military and financial support from many European nations and the United States. In the face of potential defeat, Putin has issued these threats of nuclear use to pressure Ukraine's allies to forestall their military support and extract concessions from Ukraine. These threats act as rational risks for Russia, as its adversaries will now have to dutifully consider an escalation. It is important to remember that the actual use of a nuclear weapon is not necessarily further Russia's strategic goals. The threat of use, if it is credible, is enough. The international community seemed to perceive the threat as credible, reflected by then-President Joe Biden's comments in 2022 at a fundraiser. Biden stated that the world would face the prospect of Armageddon and that he was looking for an off-ramp for Putin. This shows the effectiveness these threats can have in shifting power between states. As presented in this essay, offensive realism can provide a rational explanation for the use of nuclear threats even in that world. In the anarchic nature of the international system, the state's top priority is survival, which is contingent on the power they possess. Brinkmanship has become just another tool states can use to maximize power and achieve hegemony. And given that nuclear superiority increases the likelihood that a state will prevail in a nuclear crisis, they are incentivized to build up nuclear arsenals.
Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, you know what we're doing by this time. Take a couple minutes to decide on the kind of question you would like to put to Alex or myself about Panel 4 paper. All right, who would like to go first? Matt, thank you.
Okay. So Alex, going off of your thesis, which is you argue that under the lens of offensive realism, nuclear brinkmanship being understood as a logical strategy for maximization. One of the criticisms that I had for your paper, though I do very much enjoy your paper in the way that it is written, I would like for you to go into a little bit more detail about the strategy of nuclear brinkmanship in power maximization in regards to the Cuban Missile Crisis. You lay out the steps and pieces of evidence, but I feel like you can connect them together just a bit more effectively. More specifically, in laying out how nuclear brinkmanship maximizes the power of the United States. You state that it does, but what's the connecting tissue that links that together? You know what I mean?
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Boyle.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I would have liked a little bit more of like an in-depth, well, you actually did a pretty good job, but like a kind of like juxtaposition, I guess, more directly between blackmail and brinkmanship.
Well, I would consider brinkmanship
Mhm.
as a method of blackmail.
Okay, cool. And
Because it's using a threat of force, not the actual use of force.
yeah, and then also like,
But
you
yeah,
said
I know I kind of
Yeah.
talked about blackmail in the first part of it, and then it didn't really bring it up later, but I plan on making that.
like clarifying that connection. Yeah, man, awesome. And then also you said that I think in the beginning that that I could be wrong, could misremember this, but I think you said that Russia was hesitant to like say that they would use a nuclear weapon because of Ukraine is backed by NATO forces or something like that.
I didn't say
Or maybe I
that they were
misapprehended.
hesitant, but I would say like, from your average person's perspective,
Yeah.
it doesn't make sense for Russia to put those threats out there, because why would
And
the
then
U.S.
devil's
regulation-
advocate, why would Putin not drop a nuke, tactical nuke in a field somewhere? Considering there is
Why
no
would he
Article
not?
5. Yeah, why not? I mean, there's no treaty with Ukraine. I mean, like, he kind of would have, like, you know, the world's like, proverbial balls in his hands. So, I mean, like, the question would be, because that's something that I heard a lot when the invasion happened from, like, the military side, like, why didn't Putin just drop a nuke? Because then he would force everyone to come to the table. And so that's, like, this one, like, devil's advocate, like, thought, like, why didn't the offensive realism go further?
Now, are you using the term offensive offensive realism as a theory or as a policy?
I guess as a policy.
All right, that's an important distinction to make, because if we're talking about policies, then we're not talking about theories.
Right.
Okay.
That-
Anything else to say?
No, it's-
Okay, super. Who would like to go next?
That does kind of lead into my question. You're saying that Russia's threat to use nukes on Ukraine seems irrational and was kind of paradoxical for offensive realism. But I was wondering, like, does bluffing count as a rational action under offensive realism?
Yes, that's basically what I'm arguing in my paper, is that those threats are rational, even though to your average person they wouldn't make sense.
Why wouldn't bluffing make sense to the average person?
In terms of threatening nuclear use,
I mean, isn't it just another poker game?
well, yes, but I think when most people hear of, oh, Russia threatened to use nuclear weapons on Ukraine, that's too big of a threat for people. It's too broad.
Under what theoretical assumption is it too broad?
Sorry, I don't know what you're.
Okay, so one of the things I'm trying to do is I'm trying to steer the discussion back to theory and not to the concrete politics between Russia and Ukraine. Otherwise, the course really isn't IR theory, it's international conflict and security. So if we're going to have a course on IR theory, it's fine to use the case study, but the object is to try and understand something about the theory. So if you're making a statement with respect to bluffing, and how on the one hand bluffing is rational, but on the other hand bluffing seems irrational to the average person, I don't know why that would be the case. And if you say, well, it's nuclear weapons, and my God, nuclear weapons are just extremely destructive weapons, and you'd be suicidal to try and use them. But the question still stands: why isn't bluffing rational? Under what theoretical assumption would bluffing be irrational, even if what you're bluffing with is a threat of nuclear use? Why isn't that rational? What's the theoretical assumptions that determine whether it's rational or not?
I wanted to inform you that it already has happened, like
What has happened?
the threat of using nuclear war on the US and Ukraine, because, I don't know if you knew this, but earlier, I think it was like this year or last year, Russia had changed a document saying that they would attack a non-nuclear state if they were backed by a nuclear state, and that nuclear state provided them, what was it?
Yeah, see, I don't think Alex is denying that nuclear threats have been issued.
Because I know
But the question is slightly different. It's whether or not offensive realism would describe that kind of nuclear bluffing as rational or not. Now, it may be that you are saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it may be that you're saying that, well, offensive realism would regard it as rational, but Joe Schmo in the street, who doesn't know a damn thing about IR theory, would consider it to be irrational. Now, maybe Joe Schmo doesn't know theory from, a plumber's wrench, but he's still making theoretical assumptions, even if he can't articulate them. So what would be the theoretical assumption that would name that kind of behavior irrational? We'll get to you in a minute.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, see, and that's fine. It's fine to say I don't know, but what is important is to realize that a judgment about rationality or irrationality is predicated upon a set of theoretical assumptions. And whatever those assumptions are, we eventually would need to know, well, what would we call them other than theoretical assumptions? Would they be realist assumptions? Would they be liberal assumptions? Would they be constructivist assumptions? Would they be rational choice assumptions? What kind of assumptions would they be? Dylan.
I was just going to say, Mearsheimer does say that like the average American doesn't find realist theory very appealing, and he says that like because Americans tend to look at things not in terms of like power dynamics and power projection, but in terms of like just like liberal enlightenment theory. That could be like one avenue for like why the average person doesn't.
So I guess
Okay,
you should
so
say
the-
under liberal theory, using those threats would be considered irrational.
Yeah, like who in their
Incoherent
right
with, like-
mind would threaten genocide?
Yeah.
Right? Who in their right mind would threaten the end of humanity? I think that's what you were trying to get at.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's how we try to make sense of the theory. And ultimately what we want to ask is, what do these case studies tell us about the theory? What are we learning about the theory that we haven't already learned? Okay, who wants to go next? Thank you, Rahul. I appreciate it. Volunteering is a noble thing. Your question is?
Well, I do not have a question to ask him, but well, I do agree that in his panel, how do I put it? Well, he has presented sorry, just a minute. Like the nuclear deterrence that Vladimir Putin has threatened to deploy tactical nuclear weapon on battlefield. About the nuclear deterrence, I do not have any question, actually.
Well, there's probably a question lurking in there somewhere. How about we think of a question that goes along this line? It feels, from a general realist standpoint, that nuclear deterrence resembles defense as opposed to offense. Does that make sense? Okay. So, would Mearsheimer describe Putin's nuclear threats as deterrence, or would he describe it as something else? Does that question make sense to you? Ask it of Alex.
Yeah, I would say that Mearsheimer would describe them not as a deterrence, but as an offensive threat, because he's using that threat in order to gain concessions from his adversaries.
Okay, so do we know a term that corresponds with the making of nuclear threats that are not deterrent threats? What would we call them?
Just brinkmanship?
Brinksmanship and nuclear coercion.
Yes.
That's the language that Craning uses. So not all nuclear threats are deterrent threats. Some nuclear threats are coercive threats. And so you could call it nuclear coercion, you could call it coercive diplomacy, you could call it, in the language of Robert Art, compellence. There's a lot of different ways you can describe that behavior. All right, and compellence or nuclear coercion seems to fit in the basket of concepts of offensive realism. Okay, yes?
I think you kind of just answered my question by answering this question, but I feel like you didn't make it super clear in like your essay how nuclear brinkmanship translates to power maximization. You like kind of skirted around that a little bit. Just kind of like said like this is what offensive realism is about it, but I didn't see that much of like how it translates to power maximization.
Okay,
If that makes sense.
thank you. And Hope.
I thought your paper was really well written, well formulated, concise, and I know that you had said that you were gonna go into more depth about, some things that Matthew and, Isabel had brought up. I don't really have any critique of it. I think that everyone already else, like, said that you just need to make a couple connections, but that's about it. Like, you have solid bones. You just gotta keep the meat.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else have a question lurking off stage? No. All right. So I'm going to ask a series of questions, and of course these questions are for Alex. They're also for everyone else. I'm thinking of the second round of panels. So here's what you should expect once we start with getting into panels 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, is that I will be stepping up everything a notch or two. And my questions for Alex right now are laying the foundation for that movement upward. Okay, first question. If you could read my mind, what do you think would be the principal question I would ask you about your paper? And it's okay to say I have no idea.
Yeah, can't read minds.
Okay, fair enough. My principal question for you is, what is your interpretive question and what is your interpretive thesis? Your thesis is not about theory. Your thesis is about power maximization. That's not theory. So this is a good essay for a course in international conflict and security, but I don't know what sense you're making of offensive realism. What is the interpretive thesis about offensive realism that tells us more about offensive realism, bless you, than what we left with last week?
I guess the interpretive question I could just say, is nuclear coercion, or whatever term you want to use, a rational strategy under offensive realism? Would that fly?
I think that turns into a one-page paper.
Okay.
And it turns into yes, and here's 2 or 3 simple reasons why, and then you're done. But that's not actually interpreting offensive realism. It's just elaborating on some factor of offensive realism so that we see Mearsheimer talking about power maximization, and you're just elaborating more on that concept with respect to this case study. But we don't know really anything more about power maximization at the end than what Mearsheimer has already told us. And still, that just means that we are looking at power maximization as a concept, but we're not looking at offensive realism as a whole theory. Yes?
Could a question go along the lines of what role does nuclear brinkmanship and nuclear coercion play in offensive realist theory? Analyzing specifically the role of nuclear weapons in the theory.
That's a step in a promising direction, and I think that would just call for finding elements in Mearsheimer's discussion of nuclear weapons in the assigned chapters that we have for tonight, and then also Craning's paper, and maybe a little bit of the Sanger article, and that's just elaborating on a feature of offensive realism, so that's a step in the right direction. So let me coach the questioning process a little bit more. If you are Martin Hollis of Hollis and Smith fame, how would you make sense of Mearsheimer chapter 5, 6, 7 and the Craning article? Let's forget the newspaper article for the time being. If you're Martin Hollis, how would you make sense of this? What does it all mean?
Sorry, was Hollis the IR theorist or the philosopher?
Philosopher.
Philosopher?
For understanding.
Okay.
When incorporating like nuclear superiority and understanding and offensive realism in an interpretive question help? Like tying them together and making a thesis out of it?
Maybe. I think I need to model a particular intellectual step that's really important to take, because otherwise it's almost as if offensive realism becomes the kind of thing where we're just talking common sense. And at the point we're just talking common sense, then we're really not having a discussion of theory at all. So the reason we're looking at offensive realism as a theory is because in the Hollis and Smith analysis, offensive realism is a form of explanation. Except both Hollis and Smith agree that it's awfully hard to explain political behavior. because it's awfully hard to locate cause and effect other than just in a suggestive sort of way. Now, the best way to firm up our memories about what Hollis and Smith have said about explanation would be to go back and skim the relevant chapters, especially chapter 3 on explanation, and then the chapter on rational choice theory and why rational choice theory runs into problems, and why bureaucratic politics runs into problems, and then the debate in chapter 9, why explanation runs into problems. And you get into some interesting philosophical reasons why explanation runs into problems, and some of those were identified by people like Quine, who was a philosopher. Okay, so here you have understanding. And well, one of the things that we find out is that Mearsheimer tells us in the first 2 chapters, he's all about explanation. He's not about understanding. He's not trying to crawl into the minds of actors and reproduce their reasons. He's trying to explain cause and effect. Okay, and Mearsheimer will go, yeah, of course, that's the only legitimate way of doing social science is through an explanatory model. It doesn't seem like we can learn much more about offensive realism than what we've already covered. And now it's just a matter of looking at each of the elements and getting as fine-grained a comprehension of offensive realism as we can, and then when we're done, we're done. But what happens if we assume the persona or standpoint of Egelon, or Schaeffer with rifle theory, or Wittgenstein with his concept of games? And with these people, we're deliberately stepping outside of explanation, and we're looking at offensive realism through the lens of understanding. So if we have Mearsheimer, chapters 5 through 7, and Craning's article, and then Sanger, of course, is just a journalist, so we're going to put him in parentheses, but these are the ones we really care about. Maybe there's something new to find out about offensive realism if we adopt Wittgenstein as our starting point. If we adopt Egelon as a starting point, or Schaeffer as a starting point. You pick one of the 3 and use that as the lens to say, what do we now find out about offensive realism that we didn't know before? And that generates some original inferences. Otherwise, it's just summary and elaboration. But if we want to know something about offensive realism that doesn't come from the offensive realists, we have to stand outside their way of thinking and say, so, is offensive realism a form of life? In the Wittgenstein understanding of that phrase, do we see that here? Is offensive realism an ideology as opposed to a social science theory? Is offensive realism an expression of historical materialism in the Marxist mode. Now that would be scandalous. To say Mearsheimer doesn't even know it, but he's a damn Marxist. Not that he's arguing for communist revolution, but he's arguing for technological determinism. He has a rifle theory in offensive realism. Now, I think one reason why we're not used to thinking this way is because we're just used to reading, memorizing, and spitting stuff back up on a multiple choice test or summarizing in our essays. But the way that you can begin to think creatively and come up with something that's interesting is to say, well, what have I already read in this class that could give me an interesting starting point for which to look at something and think about it fresh? And if you just juxtapose Wittgenstein with Mearsheimer and Craning, or Egelon, or Schaeffer, now all of a sudden, interpretive questions are easier to come by. If you stay within the theory, interpretive questions are much harder to come by, especially since offensive realism, as Mearsheimer lays it out, seems like common sense. And by God, his writing style is so accessible, 8th graders can understand it. So we have to leave the confines of the theory and put ourselves in the position where all of a sudden interpretive questions are coming relatively easy to us. Like, what would Wittgenstein's take on offensive realism be? That's an interpretive question. What would Egelon's take on it be? What would Schaeffer's take on it be? What would Hollis's take on it be? All right, now once you've got the question settled, then the thesis follows from the question. And once you've got the thesis, then the thesis gives you the way to organize the paper. All right, so my recommendation ultimately is going to be, you need to do this all over again from scratch and start with a question from outside the theoretical parameters of offensive realism. Now, if you wanted to, you could have, if doing one of those three folks isn't interesting, that's fine. Well, maybe you want to do it from a liberal theorist. Especially since Mearsheimer seems to think that Americans are mostly liberals, right? So, a liberal IR theorist. Now, we haven't studied any liberal IR theorists specifically, but Hollis and Smith mention some of them in their book, and so then you just have to review that. So there's a number of starting places that would be interesting. What interests you the most as a starting place?
I would say Schaeffer's idea.
Okay.
Because in Mearsheimer's chapters 6 and 7, he just goes through the historical behavior of great powers.
Yes.
So you can relate those two and see, is this behavior, is he just justifying that through, what did you say, technological
Determinism? Okay, so I recall, and so here, one step would be, let's go back and make sure we've got all the bits of Schaeffer's argument put together. And one of the things that he argues is that there is no technological determinism. there's a lot of room for agency, because when you innovate, you have no idea what direction that technology is going to go. In fact, sometimes the technology goes in surprising directions. Okay, so if nuclear brinksmanship is a direction that the nuclear weapon is taking, was that predetermined by the invention of nuclear weapons? Or was that a step in the evolution of the technology that is really fundamentally about human agency? And that's where you're borrowing on Schaeffer's critique of technological determinism and seeing, does it apply here with respect to nuclear brinksmanship or other kinds of offensive realist descriptions? So if an offensive realist might say, we would expect states to do A, B, and C to power maximize. So power maximization just needs to be defined. It doesn't need to be elaborated. But we would need to know, what are the strategies for power maximization? Are they fundamentally material, technological avenues to power maximization? If they are, how deterministic are they? Or do they do the same kind of thing that Schaeffer discovered about what happens with rifles? That you innovate and then boom, you're surprised in the direction that it goes. My suspicion is that when you read Mearsheimer, he doesn't think that there's a lot of surprises. He thinks you can pretty much rationally forecast almost anything. Oh, really? Does that mean that Mearsheimer has never been wrong? Now, if you could find an instance where Mearsheimer was wrong about something, let's say with respect to Russia-Ukraine, not that Mearsheimer's talking specifically about Russia and Ukraine, but the general prediction about what great powers are aiming to do, okay? If he was wrong, maybe he was wrong about the determinism end of it. But then we would need to know, well, is he really arguing for determinism? So this just means you pose the question from Schaeffer, you assert the thesis, then you do the analysis, and let's see where it takes you. Does that make sense? All right. I'm satisfied that that particular objective was achieved. What did all of you get about this example that will help you for your next round of panel papers? Because you're going to be writing panel papers about either constructivism or ontological security theory. Yes?
One of the things I had noticed from your examples of interpretive analysis and interpretive questions is not to stay within the realm of just the sources that we've been given, to instead balance one theory up against another and to see parts of the merits of either one with regards to interpreting one or both theories against each other.
Yes, so there's a lot of options that are available. Here's another option. I've already mentioned it, but it's worth repeating. Let's say, no, I don't want to look at offensive realism through the lens of either of these. I want to look at offensive realism through the lens of Hollis and Smith on explanation. So then, the way that gets set up is the first part of the paper summarizes what Hollis and Smith have said about the promises and pitfalls of explanation. Then you take both the promise and pitfall part, and it's applied. Where has offensive realism in this set of readings met the promise, if at all? And where has it fallen into the pitfall, if at all? So that's another angle. But it's awfully difficult to interpret from within. It's so much easier to interpret from outside. And that means you need to have a starting place outside. So here's a starting place, here's a starting place, here's a starting place, here's a starting place, or other starting places that aren't represented on the whiteboard right now. So yes, Matt, that's the idea. You need to have an external starting point in order for interpretation to really function. Anything else? Yes?
So we need to focus more on the theory than the content of what's being taught?
Yes, because this class is about theory. It's not about international security or international law or human rights or whatever. Because see, right now, it seems like it's an international security course, and that's just because we're talking about Mearsheimer. But panel 6, it's not going to be about international security, and neither is panel 7. Now, maybe panel 8, but I'll tell you, Laura Considine's piece on narrative and nuclear weapons politics is not going to really look like an international security article. And I think some of you might find Hurst's article on playing international theory, that one you'll want to have a bottle of Tylenol right next to your books, because it's dense. Ontological security, now it's going to feel like we're back into international security studies, and similarly with panel 10. But not everything's going to be about the content of international politics, it's about the theories themselves. Thank you. Anything else? Well, this is a good excuse to take a break. How about we'll meet everybody back here, in part some of the same ground that Alex's rough draft covered, and but it's elaborating on it a little bit in more depth. So the first discussion question: what does Mearsheimer relate about offensive realist theory that is new information in chapters 5 through 7? That we received in chapters 1 through 4. And then secondly, what does Craning relate about nuclear superiority that clarifies the main arguments of offensive realism? And it would be clarity by way of illustration and let's say further elaboration on concepts. Now, question 3 exercises this skill that we were talking about before break, which is trying to have an interpretive stance on offensive realism from the vantage points of theoretical positions that we ought to be familiar with through Hollis and Smith. So if you're a rational choice theorist, what seems to be the strengths and the weaknesses of offensive realist theory? Similarly from bureaucratic politics, similarly from the reasoned role player theory, which is supposed to be that hybrid position that Hollis and Smith take after they've discussed both rational choice and bureaucratic politics. All right? Any questions about the questions in front of you? All right, well, how about we put you together in a very comfortable sort of way, meaning that you don't have to move around. How about we have you two be team 1, and you two be team 2, and you three be team 3. All right? I would like team 1 to cover question 1 and question 3A. Team 2 to cover question 2 and 3B. And then to add another perspective on either 3A or 3B, we'll have team 3 pick up 3C, and then the 3 of you decide on which of the other questions you want to comment on. That could be number 1, number 2, or number 3A, or number 3B. So it's your choice as to what your second question would be. All right? So each of you have 2 questions to manage. It is almost 8 o'clock. How about we start our discussion at 8:15? It is your time. Now, if you finish early, let me know, and we can start the discussion sooner than 8:15.
Chapter 5. He elaborates more on the goals of states. Which is to get hegemony. And then he goes into the specific strategies to shift balance of power.
So that means when team 1 on 3A, I don't know that he's put you at that point.
That's gonna work out too well for him. He's 6,000. We do that. We take the pay cut.
6,000
Yeah, 6,000.
that's delivering aid in Gaza?
100%. Well, security.
Yeah.
But there was a recent scandal with some of those guys. So, there's a bunch of shit going on. This dude doesn't.
Are they UN security forces?
Dude.
Private contractor?
Yeah. Private contractors for non-government affiliated aid distribution, which is the cover for other stuff, obviously.
But when the gangs took over Haiti, I got offered to go do a 6-month contract there for.
Dude, static security, road security was like,
Yeah.
And then chapter
6 months.
Chapter 6
This contract in Iraq as well.
goes into the history
Realism.
great behavior.
Remember. Yeah. States that prevail, states that enjoy nuclear superiority over guns, are likely to prevail in crisis. That's pretty much that's the realism theory right there. Nuclear superiority.
What'd you say? No. Did you all bring your conversations?
I did not.
I didn't even.
I don't even know what that's gonna be.
Did you buy it? Where'd you find it?
If you just Google any book and then do file type PDF.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Never did it. I did the,
I mean, what would be the relevancy to bureaucratic politics model for defensive realism? Like,
well, it's a different level of analysis, because,
within the state system? Is that what the question is asking?
yeah, bureaucratic politics analyzes state
Or how that
from
relates.
the
How, like.
bureaucratic level, and then offensive realism is at the state level.
Is that the anarchical level of states?
Yes.
Yeah, but like the question is like, how does that level of analysis between bureaucracies, or how bureaucracies affect the state level's
Yeah, it's the first thing
reaction
I
to
took when I came up with my
the anarchic sphere of states, of the international system? I don't understand what is being asked here, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But either way, I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort
Do you have an idea of people legal now? That's what bureaucratic politics
Yes. They will still keep building the.
I didn't go to.
I don't, oranges and apples here, my mom's running machine, you got something? Okay, so or the second. There's an anarchic state that states that compels states to act aggressively to maximize their power. That there's an internal bargaining within that state. The weakness would be like a hawk and a doves. Just kind of depends on the political makeup of your.
The states are reasonable.
That would basically change the political decisions as opposed to just nature compelling state action.
It's my best friend.
So, the internal politics.
So it's say like great power states seek nuclear superiority to gain strategic advantage,
State level of like maintaining power.
which
State
contradict
level, if they're more dovish, that
defensive realists
weaken
who
offensive.
see stability in deterrence. The also learn system. So
Okay.
we're gonna look at it.
Pull that out of your ass real quick,
Alright.
that was good.
Oh, I'm just gonna write a couple things down.
Yeah, I can't watch the fuck place. This sounds horrible.
Politics is driven by a small, concentrated group
Yeah, there's a
of
bunch
state
of like
actors.
smoke pits there and shit.
And
Or
their
you just run by
individual
homes, so it's kind of
control
Oh, you
the
guys
actions of
did.
the state.
Yeah,
Domestic
back.
policies
I
influence.
mean, no, dude, this was not even independent.
That's
fun.
I'll answer one.
I have a long edition because of
What'd
it.
you say?
Yeah,
I'll answer one.
The VA diagnosed it, but they haven't.
Yes, got one boy that got fucking cancer.
Act like I'm
sarcoidosis. My mom has
you know,
sarcoidosis from fucking living in Hawaii, which is crazy because it's full of fucking fuel.
So I'm fighting with the VA about that.
Dude, fuck the VA. My first VA appointment was them trying to fucking interrogate me if I smoked crack. And I was like, what the fuck?
Dude, my lady,
Crack addict.
my first appointment was for tinnitus, and she was like, have you ever heard gunfire? I was like, yeah, I was in the infantry. And she's like, treating me like a liar. She's like, what?
You've heard gunfire?
So
That's
what I'll
bullshit.
say
I'm like, what are you talking about, like?
Dude, that fucking, I set off the claymore with my ear program completely correct. You know, like the fucking shit you plug one, you're supposed to like plug in extra. Like I sat like below where you set off the
Okay,
claymore.
so what I'll say is,
Boom, you know, like.
Muir Simon extends offensive realism from theory to application. He argues that even under nuclear deterrence, MAD, NAD, great power still seek nuclear superiority to gain strategic advantage, contradicting defensive realists who see stability in deterrence. He also links system polarity to war likelihood, identifying bipolar systems as most stable and unbalanced multipolar systems as most war-prone. Finally, through historical cases like Germany and Japan, he shows that great power are often irreversible, constantly seeking opportunities to expand power and preserve
I just watched the movie Warfare the other day, because someone was like, you can watch that movie, and I'm like, no, no. So I watched it. Yeah, it's just stuff.
It was a pretty boring.
Yeah.
Simple to answer.
cross question, right?
It's not like,
And then
I guess it's the point.
you'll cross question us, right?
I mean, I think the point of just showing how like simple situations can be so complicated.
Yeah. I think the point of it is to give like a platoon sergeant like the ability to go, yeah, man, I was fucking there. Yeah. Check it out, dude. This is why you should know what a fucking knife is. Yeah, I think it's the whole point of that. You need to.
That guy could like deny mine.
No, I get it. I
It's so
just.
stupid. It's so
But
fucking
dude,
They have those fucking things you can put the card in. Yeah.
I agree.
You see like right now, it's the people wearing diamond apparel. Anyone wearing it, to be honest.
The throw vest that wear the crossed out t-shirts.
I was definitely. Are we ready?
Okay, gentlemen,
Are we ready?
Yeah,
we need a little bit more time.
ready.
Ready.
Ready?
We would like a little bit more time.
All right, a little bit more time. Let's call it 2 minutes.
Oh.
Well, 11th inning, 1-1.
Who?
Dodgers, Phillies.
You're a Dodgers fan, right?
I am.
The Bears lost. My friend like legit cried last week. But yours actually cried.
Good.
Number 1. Is that okay?
What'd you say?
It's just
Answer number 1.
Yeah.
Let's just look at
That's good.
HSP.
Any underscore?
It's the most boring name.
I'm assuming it's the one.
The whole picture.
Yeah. Did we go to that,
Year or two.
did you go to, what's the base? 173rd, so,
I was in the this was Smith. So I didn't do anything.
I was trying to go to the PX there, so that, because sometimes you can get cheap shit at the PXs. Like I know like Kaiser Slaughter or anything, you get like good deals and like right now. So. cheaper than just buying it.
All right, folks, let's begin. Team one, we're trying to figure out what Mearsheimer relates in chapters 5, 6, and 7 about offensive realist theory that is new information, something that couldn't be located in chapters 1 through 4. And there's 3 chapters to go through, so what are some of the highlights of chapters 5, 6, and 7 in that order?
Well, in chapter 1 to 4, Mearsheimer lays the theoretical foundation that he is going, and in later chapters, he moves from theory to application.
Okay.
And he argues that even under the nuclear deterrence, great powers still seek nuclear superiority to gain strategic advantage, and contradicting defensive realists who seek stability in deterrence. He also links system polarity to work likelihood, identifying bipolar systems as more stable and unbalanced multipolar as more war prone.
Okay, now let me ask this question to broaden the historical scope. Offensive realism as a theory wants to explain not just post-1945 world politics, but world politics going back to the beginning of human history. And if that's too much to grab onto, then at least back to the origin of the Westphalian state system in the 1600s. And so that means that it has to be able to explain state behavior before nuclear weapons were invented. So what are the main ideas in chapter 5 and 7 that pertain to great powers in any historical period? So we're setting aside nuclear weapons for the time being.
You said chapters 5
and 7.
In chapter 5, he lays out the specific goals that states are pursuing,
Like what?
which is achieving regional hegemony.
Okay, regional hegemony, number 1. What else?
To be wealthier than their rivals and have more military power.
Okay, now, what is crucial for any regional hegemon if they want to truly survive?
Dominate the balance of land power in the region.
In their own region, and after they've done that, what else? Now remember, we're not talking about nuclear weapons.
They need to be constantly looking for new opportunities to increase their power.
And what is the best way for them to do that with respect to other regions in the world?
Go to war.
Not necessarily. Now, it could be true that going to war is the right thing, but you could decide in one instance to go to war and in another instance to not go to war, but you'd still have the same overarching goal. So if in this fictitious world in which this is one region and this is another region and this is another region, if this is the great power and it achieves regional hegemony and it's wealthier than any other country in its region, and it's more powerful than any other country in its region, and it can dominate any other country in its region, its job isn't over yet. So what would be the objective of that great power with respect to the other regions.
To try and prevent regional powers from emerging in those areas.
Yes, so that
Regional hegemony.
means prevent peer competitors. So they would be looking at this region and that region, and they would be looking to see which country is the great power over there. And let's see what we can do to frustrate them. Because if we can frustrate that great power, then we won't have any competition in the world. We won't be a global hegemon, but we'll be the only hegemon in the world, and it just happens to be in this region. Okay, now let's say you've got country A, country B, and country C, country D, country E, and country F. And in triangle region, it's a competition between A and B. And in circle region, it's a competition between D and E. It looks like A has the advantage. So we're going to put a plus sign here. They have an advantage, but they're not a great power yet. And E has the advantage. They're not a great power yet. Using the vocabulary from chapter 5 and maybe chapter 7, what are the options for square great power?
Balancing.
Balancing. So, what does it mean for GP to balance against A?
It means they would directly engage with state A, likely in a war.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Because what does Mearsheimer argue is the preference for every regional hegemon?
Buck passing instead of
Buck
balancing.
passing instead of balancing. What does it mean to buck pass for GP with respect to triangle region?
It means they would likely provide support to state B and C in opposition to state A.
Hey, B and C, here's some aid. Stop these bastards from growing. Now, they're not directly doing the balancing. They're enabling B and C to do the balancing, but they're shifting the responsibility for balancing to B and C. And would that same thing be true over here for D, E, and F?
Yes.
Okay. Now, it's in this theoretical framework that we can then apply it to current events. So we're going to take a little detour right now and ask, can you think of anything that's going on currently in which the United States is buck passing as an offensive realist strategy?
Russia, Ukraine.
Describe.
The U.S. has provided a lot of military and financial support to Ukraine in their war against Russia in the hopes that that war will wear down Russian military power.
Yes, now that's the Biden administration, right? Is there another form of buck passing that the Trump administration is engaging in?
Yes. He's trying to put most of the responsibility on European countries.
And so if the United States isn't going to give Ukraine weapons anymore, how is Ukraine getting American weapons now?
European countries are paying for those weapons.
European countries are buying American weapons and sending them to the Ukrainians. That's buck passing times 2. Because the only other alternative is for the United States to go to war with Russia. And why would the United States not want to go to war with Russia?
It's very costly.
Very costly, and what might it trigger? Nuclear war. So notice, offensive realism does not predict or describe great powers directly confronting peer competitors unless there's no other choice. If their efforts at buck passing don't succeed, then yeah, maybe they're going to have to directly engage the prospective peer competitor. But failing that, they want others to do their work for them. And that is an offensive realist strategy. Okay? So, we've got the regional hegemony piece. We've got the maximum wealth piece. We have the preeminent land power piece. And, yes, after the middle of the Cold War, nuclear superiority. Okay. Now, what are some other offensive realist strategies for making sure that they can prevent peer competitors?
There's the bait and bleed strategy.
Yes, what's that?
That's where you try to get two of your adversaries to start a war with one another.
Ah, fascinating. That means we're looking to get A to fight E. Can you think of a historical example where the United States tried to balance one adversary off of another one? Go ahead.
Second World War.
Example.
Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, we went in late in the war. I know Mearsheimer says that was kind of like inadvertently like.
We were fashionably late to both World War I and World War II because we wanted to have both sides bleed each other. Now that's related to another strategy of the same general name, and what would that be?
Bloodletting.
Bloodletting. Let our enemies spill their own blood before we get there. And when we get there, they're going to be weaker, and it's, you know. So in boxing, everything's supposed to be a fair fight, but not in warfare. There's no expectation of fairness in warfare. Now, not everybody would agree with that because there is this tradition of honorable warfare or just warfare in which the fighting needs to be fair. And that came out of the Middle Ages. And the idea was that you couldn't really have honor and victory unless you knew that the enemy that you defeated was not horribly disadvantaged. Because there's no honor in beating up on it's like
Kicking a dead horse.
Yeah, kicking a dead horse, or like the schoolyard bully beating up on a 6-year-old. You know, somebody from high school beating up on a 6-year-old. There's no honor in that kind of victory. But if your enemy is relatively equal to you and you defeat the enemy, then that's honorable. Or if you defeat a superior foe, there's a lot of honor in that. But I don't think offensive realism cares about honor. It strikes me that offensive realism, it's just about winning. Because it's just about survival. So you have this bait and bleed and bloodletting, because eventually if you ever have to get into a fight with A or E, or maybe both of them together, they're not going to be up to the fight. They're going to be defeated practically before you get to them. Okay, now, let's look then at chapter 7. And we're right now skipping over chapter 6 because it's a long chapter having to do with several case studies in which each one of these case studies is supposed to illustrate something about those strategies and goals in history. And we see, oh yeah, hey, look, offensive realism can describe and explain Japan and Germany and Italy and United States and all these other countries. What do we mean by offshore balancing?
That would be one of the insular powers, like the U.S. or the United Kingdom.
Okay,
balancing
what makes
each
them an
other.
insular power?
Their isolation due to
Yes.
water or the absence of another regional power.
Okay, so if we modify our map here to have it be two contiguous regions where square region is separated by water from this oblong kind of region or series of regions, then it's going to be that the great power is going to want to balance from afar. So that turns out to be an offensive realist strategy too. Not getting directly involved, but trying to do those things in which they function as a balancer and therefore frustrate the rise of a peer competitor overseas. So Britain does this because they're an island. United States does this because in some respects they're an island. It's hard for a continental power to be a balancer of that kind because they're not insular. They're wrapped up in the geography and they have to find another way to balance. So let's see, is there anything else that we should? So here's where you get from page 238 onward the description of the United States as a great power via offshore balancing. And some of the information that is contained in here draws upon information in chapters 1 through 4. Like I'm looking at table 7.1 on page 241, where we see statistics about population and percentage of the whole, right? And so we see just the dramatic advantage that the United States begins to have over time. And the role of the Monroe Doctrine. And then on page 248, we have a comparison between the United States and the United Kingdom, with the United Kingdom being the former imperial hegemon of their time. And yet, good grief, by the time you get to 1900, it seems like the writing is on the wall that Great Britain's days are numbered. And it would strike me as unusual if the leaders of the time didn't see the writing on the wall. That is, if they had adequate information coming into them about relative wealth, relative population, relative power, and so forth. Now, if we were going to apply this to the present time, then that would mean this. We would want to have some reasonable forecasts that compared the United States and China in these very domains. Like, what would we expect China's population to be in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? What would we expect China's economy to be in the same segments of time? what would we expect the United States to be in those areas over the next period of time? And before we see if there's anything else to discuss in question number 1 before we move on to question 2, I had this discussion the other day with Dr. Paul DeHart, and we were talking about the U.S. federal budget. And he was relating that by the time we get 2034, the interest on the U.S. debt is going to be high enough that we will not experience growth in the U.S. economy anymore at all. And that's just because for the last several years, the federal budget has made sure that spending really didn't go down all that much. DOGE didn't really cut spending, not in any serious way. But the big piece is that if taxes are constantly lowered, and the budget expenses go up and up and up and up, especially the part of the budget that's devoted to paying interest on the debt, then there's no way to close the gap, and at some point the economy just utterly stalls. And if that is not corrected by 2050, then the expectation of economists is that we'll go into a depression-like period with a major economic reset. The dollar will be ridiculously devalued. And an offensive realist would really want to care about that. For survival reasons. Now, a liberal might have a different set of reasons as to why they would care about that, because they would care about, oh my God, massive poverty, right? I mean, imagine hyperinflation like what some countries in Latin America or Eastern Europe or other places experience as a matter of routine. If the dollar faces hyperinflation, that's going to be in your lifetime. And that would make it awfully hard for the US government to keep up with China if China avoids all that. Yes?
Wouldn't it be like in Europe's interest that the US doesn't go through that, because our
It's in
economy-
everyone's interest that the US doesn't go through that. But what are we to make of the declining population rate? When Franklin Roosevelt put Social Security into place, it was dependent upon a ratio of 20 workers to every one person who was retired. And the break-even point for Social Security is that for every person that retires, you need like 4 or 5 people to be employed that pay into Social Security so you can get it, right? Well, with population going the way that it is right now, the ratio is 2 to 1.
Would this change if we changed immigration policy though? Like, would this be a problem if we allowed more More, yeah, exactly.
Possibly, but one of the problems is that certain kinds of labor don't pay into Social Security.
Yes. And right
So,
now-
I mean, if you say, what about the people who come from Mexico, come from other parts of Latin America, and they're itinerant farmers? They follow the seasons in terms of picking vegetables, picking fruit, all that kind of stuff. Dude, that's a cash economy. None of them pay into Social Security.
What if-
So since so many of the people that work in those kinds of fields are on the cash economy, it doesn't help that ratio.
But if we changed immigration policy to include them getting Social Security, would that change things? Like, if we come to
It
this.
could, but then what you would, so with every decision that you make to do that, it has ripple effects in other parts of it, and there's trade-offs, right? And so since that's a political decision, the political decision then would be, if making it more likely to increase this ratio would mean food prices would go up, is that something that folks would want? And I think you'd find some people saying yeah, and other people going no way. And then it would be a matter of finding out, well, what's the majority vote?
But wouldn't that happen organically like it is now?
No, not necessarily. Because
I feel like inflation, it's going to continue, but the difference is if we raise minimum wage, then we would be able to survive a little bit more. Like, I feel like if we change the structure itself, like with immigration and with workers' wages, then maybe there could be something done.
so if I put on my Mearsheimer hat, I'd have to say, I'm going to defer all of the economic analysis to those who specialize in the economics. And what I would say is, if the American economy stalls and goes into depression and has a major reset, that's going to have implications for our ability to remain a regional hegemon without having peer competitors. And that would be the offensive realist analysis. There's other inferences that one could draw for other reasons. But from the vantage point of offensive realist theory, like just look at table 7.2 on page 248. I bet you the United Kingdom went through that kind of angst.
Yes.
They knew their empire was fading. Well, what are you going to do now?
Yeah.
What are you going to do now? Thank God it's the United States that's the peer competitor. So there was kind of like a passing of the torch between Britain and the United States. Yes?
Like in terms of like U.S. as a regional hegemon, like aren't so many of like Latin America's countries tied, like economically tied to the dollar, like when the
Yeah.
dollar
Yes.
devalues?
Yes, they are. And if the U.S. economy falls, Latin America's going to suffer.
Think more.
So then-
Canada's going to suffer.
Yeah.
So then wouldn't there like not be a regional, like, would it?
There may not be a regional hegemon. Just like in this fictitious region, there's not a regional hegemon, but there's competitors. I mean, you could think of, who's the regional hegemon in Africa? It's hard to think of one. Right? I mean, maybe there are candidates, but I don't know if there's a single African country that could dominate over every other African country in the same way the United States dominates over the Western Hemisphere. So it might be that there are no regional hegemons, and that just means that there's intense security competition within each region. And there's no way to prevent a country from becoming a regional hegemon if it finds an advantage. And at that point, there's no status quo powers. Every power is a rising power. Okay, gentlemen, anything else that we need to say about chapters 5 and 7 before we move on? All right. Question number 2, Team 2. What does Craning relate about nuclear superiority that clarifies the main arguments of offensive realism?
So so the concept of like a good offense is a good defense. That is definitely supported by the conclusion of this paper, which is states that enjoy nuclear superiority over their opponents or more likely to prevail in nuclear crises, and which was backed up with like the expected probability of victory in a nuclear crisis for a country in a position of nuclear inferiority is 6%, whereas the inverse is 57%. Increase in the expected probability of victory if you move from a position of inferiority to superiority.
Okay. All right. Now, what are the main arguments of offensive realism that clarifies?
Well, if the main goal is survival, there's basically no downside to having more nukes.
No downside to having more nukes. Okay. And would Craning think that nuclear superiority was a necessary element in preventing peer competition? And if he doesn't say anything about that directly, what do you think he would say?
Could you repeat that question?
Yeah. Would Craning argue that nuclear superiority was necessary for preventing peer competition in other regions?
In other regions, as in like near the insular country.
So remember, it's the regional hegemon that wants to prevent the rise of regional hegemons elsewhere in the world. So would one country having nuclear superiority effectively increase the chances that they could prevent a regional hegemon from rising in another part of the world?
I mean, if you,
I think you would say yes.
Why?
if that country used the nuclear superiority to coerce the rising power to stop him.
Okay, so essentially what you're saying then is this. We would expect the most serious nuclear crises to take place between countries that are either regional hegemons or aspiring regional hegemons, because after all, they have nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and he places like emphasis on like the nuclear crisis being like a serious issue, and he says that he found like, for instance, that he doesn't find any support that like conventional military balance has an important bearing on the crisis between nuclear armed powers, and it's just the nuclear capability that is like of the utmost importance.
Okay,
So
now why does it not bother the United States that England or France has nuclear weapons? From an offensive realist perspective, why does it not bother us?
If we have a common enemy, then it's basically like combining our nuclear forces against the regional hegemon that we're trying to fight against.
We also have nuclear superiority, as I think this author would say, we have nuclear superiority over them, whether they're an ally or not.
Okay, so at this point we have, the United States has something like 6,000 nuclear weapons, and Britain maybe has 350. France maybe has 350. That's clear nuclear superiority, right? Yes.
Is it because they're not like regional hegemons?
They're not regional hegemons. So I think it's probably correct to say that China is aspiring to be a regional hegemon, if not one already. Maybe one could make the same argument about Russia, except that would be harder to make because of their wealth. Is India a regional hegemon? I see some heads shaking no. I see some other heads going, not so sure. Pakistan would not be a regional hegemon. But they're a nuclear enemy of India, right next door. Is Israel a regional hegemon? Some of you are going, yeah, others of you going, but Israel's nuclear armed. So, is there a nuclear crisis happening between Russia and Ukraine?
I would say so.
Is it possible to have a nuclear crisis if one of the parties is not nuclear armed?
Yes, because they can be backed by a nuclear weapon state.
Then between which states would the nuclear crisis actually be?
The U.S. Russia.
And Russia. Well, the United States and Russia have had their share of nuclear crises, haven't they?
Yes.
And according to Craning and others, why was the Cuban Missile Crisis settled in favor of the United States?
Because they have nuclear superiority.
Because the United States had nuclear superiority. And if the United States does have a nuclear crisis with the country and is forced to back down, it's because they don't have nuclear superiority anymore. So if you think about nuclear superiority, it's a relationship between specific countries. So right now, the US has about 6,000, but Russia has about 6,500 nuclear weapons. There's not a nuclear superiority relationship here. It's relatively equal. China has about 800. They're moving towards 1,000. All the other countries of the world, they have 350 or less. So, the US has nuclear superiority vis-a-vis Pakistan, but it doesn't have nuclear superiority vis-a-vis Russia. And if we're in the middle of a nuclear crisis between the United States and Russia over Ukraine, then the lack of superiority means that that crisis is not necessarily likely to resolve in our favor. So, final question to Team 2, does it make sense what Biden's policy towards Russia was as reported by Sanger? Is it rational? Would an offensive realist judge Biden's policy towards Russia and their nuclear threats with respect to Ukraine as a rational reaction?
I would say yes.
Okay, elaborate.
I think taking like a direct stance against Russia's invasion, taking that hardline stance is, I mean, it's just, to me, it's just very much offensive realism. Whereas I feel
that the pivot that we've seen, and which relates to the bureaucratic politics model, we'll say in the state, has been, the shift in bureaucracies has shifted foreign policy more away from an offensive realist strategy, I think.
Okay, so what I'm trying to do is see what can we draw from chapter 5? Do we see the Biden administration in its reactions to Putin in 2022? Do we see them doing anything in terms of strategies for checking aggressors, like page 155 onward?
Could be like bloodletting.
Bloodletting, except they're letting the Ukrainians draw the blood of the Russians. Okay? And is there anything in here that feels like buck passing?
I mean, I think Biden's admin was treating it like a proxy war.
To some extent, right? Now, it put restrictions on Ukrainian uses of American weapons, and it took a long time for the Biden administration to agree that the Ukrainians could use some U.S. missiles to strike deep into Russia. But at the point that they agreed to that, it seemed like, all right, now this is a more robust buck-passing strategy. And it's a more robust bloodletting strategy. So, bait and bleed them, bait and bleed them, bait and bleed them, but not confront Russia directly, because then that calls Putin's bluff. And if he's not bluffing, we're in the middle of a nuclear war. All right, anything else to say about number 2, gentlemen? No. Okay, so back to team 1. Take the following theoretical position and comment on the strengths and weaknesses of offensive realist theory that arises from rational choice theory. What do you think?
So rational choice theory would focus on individuals as actors, where offensive realist theory focuses on the system level. Rational choice theory would say that states are made up of an aggregation of the individuals, and the international system is made up of an aggregation of those states. So it focuses on the decisions that individuals make. And it also says that in terms of rationality, rational choice theory says rationality is when an individual takes actions toward their preferences, which can be a range of things. But in offensive realism, the goal is power maximization. But with rational choice theory, that goal can be something else depending on what that individual's preferences are.
Okay, now, would a rational choice theorist say that if we move up from the individual level to the state level, that we can treat states as individuals?
Yes.
Okay, so then rational choice theory could occupy either individual level of analysis or state level of analysis. But what I hear you saying towards the end there was that the preferences that offensive realism identify in terms of survival and hegemony and preventing peer competition, there's a lot more preferences that would be available that would also be rational, and as long as they're thinking that way, then rational choice theory would want to include that as well, right? Team 3, anything to say about that in agreement or disagreement or addition or what?
Alex had outlined exactly what I was going to say in that rational choice theory. Agrees very much with offensive realist theory, but where it disagrees is on the self-interest maximization, in that it can be any number of things. Hollis and Smith on page 153 actually outlined that perfectly in one of their criticisms, in that rational choice theory does not give a preference for things such as power, wealth, money, etc. The preference, it has nothing to say about preference. It's just within the interest of the individual or in the state, depending on which level of analysis you're going to go with. But offensive realism only seeks to analyze it at the state level, not the individual level.
Right.
The individual unit of analysis does not matter. It does not function into the equation when it comes to offensive realism.
Okay, all right. But then that just means that there are a lot of similarities in terms of the employment of means ends rationality.
Yes.
And neither of those theories endorse the use of Ouija boards or say that they are aiming towards understanding. They're looking for cause-effect relationships, right? Okay, then team 2, speak to the strengths and weaknesses of offensive realist theory from bureaucratic politics.
So, offensive realist theory could be, it's at the mercy of, I guess, the bureaucratic state of affairs within a state. For instance, as aforementioned, the Trump administration, the change of bureaucracy changed how we countenanced Russian aggression in Ukraine. And so, I mean, even though like the anarchic, like, situation of states might like compel states to act offensively and aggressively, is what OR theory suggests. When you have like, say, like Dubs come into power in the state,
Yes.
then that would kind of throw a wrench in things. Like, you know, I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that OR theory is incorrect. That should just mean that a state is acting against its best interests. But
From the viewpoint of
viewpoint of
offensive
OR,
realism, the state is acting against its best interests. But if you were to put that question to the bureaucratic politics model, they would say, no, the offensive realists don't have any authority to say that. That is their opinion, but they don't have authority. Okay, so let me say a few things about bureaucratic politics versus structural realism. One of the most famous debates in the field of nuclear weapons was between Kenneth Waltz, who you've heard that name before as a structural realist, but he's a defensive realist, and Mearsheimer talks about him at length in the first part of the book, and Scott Sagan, who teaches at Stanford and is probably one of the big names in the field of nuclear proliferation. In 2003, they co-authored a book titled The Spread of Nuclear Weapons, a Debate. And Waltz took up the structural realist analysis, and he made it pretty simple in the title of his chapters. More nukes are better. Now, this is something that John Mearsheimer would agree with and Matt Kroening would agree with. More nukes are better. We should not fear nuclear proliferation. The reason we should not fear nuclear proliferation is that the more nuclear weapon states there are, the more stability you're going to have in the system. And it's going to be a stability that's based in terror, because no one is going to want to make the fatal mistake that triggers a war. So both Ken Waltz and John Mearsheimer published articles along the lines of Iran should have a nuclear weapon. Saudi Arabia should have a nuclear weapon. Japan should have a nuclear weapon. South Korea, you name it, if they're in a tough neighborhood, they ought to have a nuclear weapon. There's nothing to be afraid of. And this comes from the system level analysis that the more power is distributed across the units, the more a balance of power is going to emerge, and balances of power stabilize things. I mean, after all, that's the whole point of balancing. If you balance, you prevent hegemony from challenging the order. Scott Sagan was not convinced. His chapter was the exact opposite. More nukes are worse. And he had a bureaucratic politics argument. And he went through and he talked about how bureaucratic politics is just infected with dysfunction. There's going to be some bureaucracies that think that if we have nuclear weapons, we ought to use them because we need to win the nuclear war. Then there's going to be other bureaucracies that wholeheartedly disagree. But what happens if the militaristic bureaucracy takes over the government? Then they're not going to exhibit these kinds of rational restraints that Ken Walsh predicted we would see. No. Like in a country like Pakistan, where the military runs the government and the civilian government is just kind of there. Well, we ought to be afraid, Sagan would argue, of Pakistan having nuclear weapons because they don't have that fire break in their governmental system where all things nuclear are run by civilians. I mean, it's no accident in the United States that it's the Department of Energy that is the manager of nuclear weapons, not the Department of War. Energy Department, my God, in the first Trump administration, that was your favorite governor and mine, Rick Perry, was the Secretary of Energy. And he was the manager of nuclear weapons. It wasn't put in Jim Mattis's hands. Now, the order to fire nuclear weapons is within the president's domain. And if he gives the order to fire, then it goes to strategic, Stratcom and all the way through. And that's not Department of Energy. But everything else with respect to the nuclear arsenal and the management of all that, that's DOE. And for countries that don't have that fire break between civilian and military, Sagan argued, you need to really worry about it. So the bureaucratic politics take on offensive realism is those folks are way too confident about their predictions. They really don't understand how fragile everything is. And I think Sagan would be more than happy to say, let's not forget that Pelopidas article about normal accident theory. That's something that offensive realism sort of doesn't want to look at because it's not a system level input. But bureaucratic politics wants to look at inputs not just from the system, but from the state and specifically from the bureaucracies. Anything else we want to say about bureaucratic politics? Okay, so notice what we've got so far. From a rational choice perspective, we have a partial interpretation of offensive realism as usefully explaining this, usefully explaining that, but its limit is exactly at the boundary where they don't want to go down to the state or the individual level, right? And they miss a lot if they don't go down to those levels. And the bureaucratic politics model pretty much agrees with that and says if all you do is stay at the system level, you miss a lot of what goes on. And it's important stuff you don't want to miss. All right, 3C, reasoned role player theory. What's your take on the strengths and weaknesses of offensive realist theory?
So reasoned role player theory would find that from a theoretical view, would find that offensive realism suffers from the weaknesses of not considering the heuristics, the upbringing and personal biases of state actors in making policy decisions. Reasoned role player theory would argue that the personal motives of presidents, prime ministers, and other state leaders would be important considerations in understanding why states make decisions in the way that they do. Okay, and so here we once again are finding a point of oversight in offensive realist theory. Now, it's important to go back to Mearsheimer because Mearsheimer does not claim that every great power always behaves according to the prescriptions of offensive realist theory. So sometimes they don't do that. And then guess what? They pay the price for it. So offensive realism is committed to the following logical claim. If great power follows offensive realist prescriptions, success is more likely. It's not guaranteed, but it's likely. If great power does not follow offensive realist policy, then failure is likely. And failure here then would probably mean failure in preventing the rise of peer competition. Failure in offshore balancing. Failure in bait and bleed. Failure in buck passing. Ultimately, failure to maintain regional hegemony, and that might be something that offensive realism would say maybe explains Germany's fate, or explains Italy's fate, or Japan's fate, if they didn't follow offensive realist prescriptions. Of course they could, and they would still lose if their competitor plays the game better than they do. But from a reasoned role player stance, there might be good reasons to not follow offensive realist prescriptions. And what if they end up succeeding? Then that becomes an anomaly for offensive realism. So if you were writing a PhD thesis, or maybe even an ambitious master's thesis, a question could be this: when has a great power deliberately avoided offensive realist prescriptions and succeeded? And what explains that? That would be going after
the theory's explanatory power and predictive power. And then if you found 2 or more case studies, well, that would be an impressive thesis to write. And it would certainly catch some people's attention. All right, I have nothing else. Do you have any questions, comments, complaints, or whatnot? Yes?
This is like kind of off topic, but why do we have so many nukes? Like, isn't that like kind of an excessive?
No, you know what? Let me take that as an opportunity to talk about an idea that was in Alex's rough draft. He talked about second strike capability.
But do you need that many nukes for second strike capability?
It depends. Because it's not just how many you have as an absolute number, it's also how many does your rival have? Alex, what's second strike capability?
It's when if a nuclear armed power attacks you, then that sets off triggers for these second strike capabilities to go and attack the other power.
Okay, so here's the United States looking at it flat from space, and here's Russia looking at it flat from space, and the curvature of the world. Okay, so let's say that the Russians look at their radar and they see a whole bunch of dots on that, and they think, holy hell, they're attacking us with nuclear weapons. It's a flock of geese, but they still fire their nuclear weapons because they think they're being attacked. We pick up their nuclear weapons on our radar about here. The president decides to fire our nuclear weapons right about here. We can't shoot theirs down, they're going too fast. So then ours go over here. That's the first strike. Second strike capability is about the nuclear weapons that have survived the first attack. Do you have enough to do a second strike?
How many does it take to do a first strike then?
It depends on how many the other side has. See, if the United States is in a nuclear war with North Korea, it's our 6,000 against their 80 or so. They don't have a second strike capability against the United States. We have way more than a second strike capability against North Korea. But what if the war is between the United States and Russia and both of them have 6,000 nuclear weapons? Well, then it depends on how many are launched in the first strike. And no one knows that until it happens. So let's say that you take 6,000 and go, all right, we know where their land-based nuclear weapons are, and we know where their gravity nuclear bombs are, the ones that they would put in airplanes and drop. So what we want to do is hit their land silos and hit their air bases. But we really don't know where their subs are. So you go after the land-based missiles. That means a lot of the second strike capability is going to be in the submarines. So after the first strike is over, you take stock of what's survived. And if you have a second strike ability that can really hurt them, now you're in a position to either gain an advantage or continue the escalation forward until someone loses. Because the whole prospect of a full exchange of nuclear weapons is to make sure that the other side, after they've lost a whole bunch of stuff, can never recover again. So it's the nuclear strategy is really about annihilation. Ultimately, if there is no control on the escalation cycle. Now, mountains and mountains and mountains of articles and books have been written about how you can control the escalation cycle. And I think your paper mentioned Thomas Schelling. He's one of those folks that write about that. Other people like Herman Kahn wrote about it. It's all speculation because we've never had a nuclear war, so we really don't know whose speculation is right. What I've read, final comment, what I've read is that people in the US military and the Russian military and others who routinely run nuclear war games, they find it very difficult to control escalation in the nuclear war game. Either they're utterly horrified in their imagination about what they're pretending to do to real people, or they just think it's a big chess game and let's blow everything up. And if it's in that latter element, nobody cares about controlling escalation. And if you don't care about controlling escalation, then you don't care about environmental impacts of nuclear weapons, you don't care about nuclear winter, you don't care about the survival of the human race, or you don't care about the fate of the human race if the human race survives. There. With that cheerful note, let's bravely run away. Check the Dodger game.